Welcome, everyone, to episode 8 of The Alignment Gap. Today, with me, I have Remmelt Ellen, and he is the coordinator of all the projects and the organizer of AI Safety Camp. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, nice to meet you, and happy to have this call.
Yeah, I guess just quickly before we start on any questions, really, just a quick introduction of what you do, what got you into this space, and a bit about your background, if possible.
Yeah, so I'm co-running a program called AI Safety Camp, which is a place that people can basically work together on an interesting project for 3 months. We currently have edition 11 going, and yeah, it's a way to actually try to work on AI safety by working on a concrete problem and see how that works. And in that way, also just connect with other people in the community. Yeah, and we've had some interesting kind of work papers and things come out. But I think one of the things is just like the way it enables people to dig into actual work and try and understand that work and try and see like, hey, what are the limitations of the work I'm pursuing here? Um, and yeah, and actually, so I've been running that since 2018, so like for 7 years. But over time, actually, my understanding of the problem that we're trying to solve here, AI safety, has shifted as I started to get a firmer grip on what we were actually talking about. So, like, I came in basically as someone who had a bit of a engineering background, who studied engineering, but for the most part, I was just like, okay, there are these apparently very smart people in the community that the friends of mine say are very, very smart. And like sometimes they say vague things, but it must be because they're very smart and they don't understand them. So that's where I started. Um, and over time, I actually met I mean, there were some ways that I felt like the community was already a little bit had sort of kind of narrow approaches of ways of thinking about things, and I felt like there might be gaps there or things that we might be missing that could be critical. So the community has had a very much of a tendency. It's a bit of a nerdy thing to want to kind of not think about messy contexts and just kind of decouple from that and say like, okay, let's work with this really neat kind of mathematical abstractions, and then just assume that's going to actually represent what's going on in the real world.
Yeah.
So that's a real tendency. There's a tendency to kind of not really look as much at historical trends or things, like maybe in other communities kind of hold kind of these long traditions or like even like kind of mythologies about like how things are. And like this community very much has this kind of forward-looking kind of like, oh, what's the future approach. Um, so that was another thing I noticed. And there was a bit of a tendency to want to kind of create kind of think about AI as this nice kind of structured kind of single entity. So it's just like, okay, this some future AI will be this kind of single, like there was particularly in the early days of this community, there was this idea like, okay, at some point AI will develop into kind of like a singleton, like one single entity that has like this coherent kind of goals that it can just kind of, because it's so intelligent, it will just be able to pursue those goals and able to do whatever it wants. However, this is basically how the community started. Is people were really excited about that idea of like some technology like that somehow like transforming the world. So these were the transhumanists like Elia Zukowski, Nick Bostrom, the people I initially looked up to. Um, kind of saying that and like saying like, okay, yeah, like the technology is going to keep progressing. And eventually, we'll get to something like that singleton that will, just transform the world. But if it has certain goals, we need to make sure that these goals actually are aligned with the goals we have or the preferences that we have. Um, and if it doesn't, because it's so intelligent, quote unquote, and so able to kind of pursue, like optimize for certain goals or and plan for those goals, it would like just basically it could very easily destroy the world. So that's kind of where the community started, and I noticed there were certain ways that was kind of also stuck. Like there's this assumption of this kind of like individual, kind of separate kind of entity, and there was this assumption of kind of coherency in terms of the goals and the things that outcomes that pursued in the world. Um, and at that point, I actually met a someone who was the former senior engineer working at the Pentagon to design search algorithms for searching classified, unclassified documents at the Pentagon. So they're still, I think, using some of that, like, yeah, basically the major kind of stuff in terms of the algorithms he designed, like back in, I think he worked there from 1999 to 2006. So this was a very smart guy and actually a polymath, like designing these
Right.
architectures, like hardware and like, because the problem with the Pentagon is that they had all of this all this documentation like
Yeah.
in various different places. So you needed to kind of somehow search across all those different hardware stacks. And yeah, there's just a lot of work there as far as I understand that he had to do. So like in that way, he was smart and he has a lot to share. But he had a very kind of broad like way of kind of looking at the world and kind of trying to start at first principles. Um, so a friend actually pointed to like an early draft that he shared at the time. I think it's now no longer available, which was called "On the Dialogue of the Impossibility of AI Alignment." And yeah, I mean, I was getting a little skeptical about the community I was in, but I was also a bit like, wait, this guy just seems to be confirming the view that he already had. What do we do here?
Mhm.
Like, but at the same time, I was very much looking for people with different perspectives. I was trying to kind of get outside of the bubble I was in.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. As you're mentioning, kind of, I guess within that realm of how you kind of got into AI alignment in general. Um, what even is a couple of definitions, I guess. What even is alignment? What is AGI? What does control mean in this sense?
yeah, yeah, that I noticed, myself, like at the time, it was a little vague. Like, what do people actually mean?
Right.
Um, and I think this is actually a very important question because it's easy once you kind of start thinking vaguely about things, it's easy to kind of well, there's this problem that even in a conversation, like if you and I kind of talk about AI and like people throw around that term all the time, like you and I could be meaning entirely different things.
Right.
Like maybe you're talking about something like, okay, there's this large language model, maybe Claude, and it seems to be, you seem to be able to use it like for a lot of kind of text processing, and it seems to be doing some kind of systematic analysis, even though it's, also just fabricating numbers or things like that. So you're saying like, okay, there's something general about this. And so this, you can say like, okay, this is not just some kind of neural network, but it's there's something like I'll call it like a general AI.
Yeah.
The AGI term that people throw around a lot, like artificial general intelligence.
Right.
Uh, I think on the other hand, what I'm going to talk about here in terms of AI is a bit different. So um, the concern that people actually had at the time with the AI safety community was like something that would like take over. And there were like, there was a particular narrative that people had that I think was a bit too simplified. But as a way of thinking about it, I mean, their narrative was basically like, like internally, this model would just somehow kind of be able to reprogram itself and it would just recursively improve itself really,
Right.
really fast without having to interact much in the environment. And then like it becomes so intelligent that it can just plan about everything in the world and it just plans to take over and it takes over. That
Yeah.
was a simple kind of way of thinking about it.
Yeah. So you're saying about like, how AGI was kind of defined and how it was kind of portrayed in a sense.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, on one hand, you have something like you can maybe call Claude AGI in some sense. And people have this story. People have this story. Sorry, let me change that. The thing is that what the community or people in this ASX community originally were concerned about is something that would actually take over. It wouldn't just be some kind of model kind of replying to our questions or our prompts and generating response to that, but it would be something that would actually take over the world. And they
Yeah.
had what I think was a somewhat simple narrative, which is something like, hey, like all of this internal, whatever it's doing in terms of information processing internally, like that is enough for it just to kind of take over the world. And like, so basically people have this idea of like, I think what they call like um, some kind of rapid kind of recursive self-improvement where it would, maybe in days it would just like, get really, really smart. And then like, because it's really, really smart, it can like the humans have also been smart and that's how we able to basically take over the world. And this machine will be even smarter than us and it will take over the world.
Right.
So that's a roughly like I think how people talked about it in the community. And I now think that's actually not realistic because, of course, you can have algorithms that are just that seem very kind of capable and able to improve themselves very fast uh, within particular constraints. So, for example, if you have chess playing kind of AIs, you had something called like AlphaGo
Yeah.
uh, or AlphaOne, I think in this case, that were able to basically kind of just simulate gameplay. But so you have this chess boards or Go boards, and you have like particular kind of transitions across what's like a finite space. And yeah, in that case, of course, you can just model all of that internally. You just like have a very kind of simple chessboard or Go board,
Right.
and like any kind of uh, action you have like has kind of a definite kind of consequence.
Hmm.
But the real world doesn't work like that. You know, the real world is actually, like it's much more complex than whatever kind of deterministic kind of model that you can kind of run on a computer.
Right.
Um, and there's real kind of chaos in terms of, there's ways that you you cannot actually deterministically calculate ahead of time what's going on. Um, and in that sense, this notion of like, okay, you just need this model that just like internally kind of programs itself and then it just like takes over, it doesn't quite make sense. And I think what does make sense is that, okay, there's an attempt now at automating away intellectual or creative work. And we're already seeing that with creatives and what they're encountering and how their works are basically taken without their consent.
Yeah.
And and we basically just get a lot of uh, yeah, AI generated kind of content kind of spreading around everywhere and looks kind of accurate, but and often it just ends up being used for disinformation or propaganda. So we're kind of at that phase right now. But from here, there will be increasing attempts by tech companies to find ways to automate physical work as well. So basically, most physical work, just in terms of raw power, has already been automated. Since the early 1900s, horses just horses just started to get automated away using cars. And at that point, like people were just like, there's no way we can kind of beat the machines in terms of raw horsepower.
Right.
So like that's long gone, like we're now just remaining as an intellectual appendage that's kind of steering these machines. But the obvious thing that companies are going to try and do and already trying to do is find ways to basically connect up some kind of AI models to these systems and basically kind of be sensing and kind of actuating through these automobiles, automotive robots, so that you no longer have to pay the humans, which are kind of people are kind of humans are kind of fuzzy anyway.
Yeah.
They have to sleep. There's just lots of inconvenience there. Like if you get the machine to automate all of that, it's going to be more cost effective. So
Yeah.
that's basically the next step. And people like Peter Thiel have been talking about like basically getting back into the atom world, or Elon Musk, all these other people. They're all pushing in this direction.
Right.
It's of course, once you get into kind of this physical kind of messy world, and I think robot engineers like have a lot of experience with this, instead of like something that you can kind of like neatly simulate on the inside, things become different. You actually have to, in the end, you'll have to actually experiment in terms of what works, because like sometimes you actually just have to find out. So you have to just kind of run it in the real world to see what happens, and you
Right.
can't actually properly model all of that and
Yeah.
simulate all of that internally. So it's this is a slower process, but as these companies find ways to automate physical work, the next step will be, okay, so now we've got these learning robot systems, but there's still people involved in producing these robot systems. That people involved with like producing the hardware, chips, and like all kind of the supply chains, these very kind of extensive supply chains across like 3 continents to create these learning robot systems.
Right.
So what there will be more and more of an attempt to also push people out of the loop there.
Yeah.
So like instead of having these kind of slow kind of uh, non-pure kind of human apes go around in clean rooms and things like that, you find ways to remove them out of the loop and just have these kind of robotic assembly lines produce the robot parts much faster, so that you can have more robots producing more work for more profit, and there will be a tendency to compete towards that. Um, so I'm really talking about a long-term trend here, and of course, for each of these, we're already seeing some of these things happening. We're already seeing the automation of some kind of definitely routine kind of cognitive work, accounting, that sort of things, but also some kind of creative, quote unquote,
Yeah.
intellectual work. Um, we're seeing self-driving cars like Waymo on the streets in San Francisco. And, a lot of manufacturing work has already been not only outsourced from the US, but actually, roboticized. Um, and the longer term trend is basically to have machines run things by themselves and to basically have the machine economy split off from this kind of human organic economy.
Mm.
And it's because the machines just have certain inherent advantages.
Yeah.
Like as I mentioned, it takes humans basically seeding this machine economy, kind of doing the kind of um, the work to kind of bootstrap the machines to kind of actually be able to perform this labor. But the inherent advantage they have basically is because they are hard, kind of standardizable machine components. This is what these AI systems or these robotic systems are made of. Yeah, there's just certain inherent advantages that they have. Um, so if you have standardized hardware components, you can actually where the configurations are kind of fixed. That's very different than like how our human brains work. Like for
Yeah.
us, you have all these neurotransmitters, these comparatively heavy neurotransmitters, kind of having to kind of move around in order for signals to be to be kind of transmitted and processed through our brains.
Right.
Whereas in this hardware, where like the silicon and the other kind of substrate is kind of fixed, and you just have light electrons or maybe photons moving around, you can actually process information much faster
Mm.
and in standardized ways because these are kind of standardized parts that don't constantly kind of deform and kind of mix in ways that like our human bodies do. Um, and in terms of physical work, because these we're talking about hard machines, they can channel much more energy into
Yeah.
work. For example, electric motors. Like there's just limited things that we can do with our physical appendages as
Yeah.
humans. Like we can't really move so much around with our arms. Like this
Yeah.
is why we're like already kind of relying a lot on like things like cars and machine tools, drills, and all that stuff. We basically just can't channel that much energy for a body. Where, like, I mean, if you if you try and just put more electricity or energy into a body, we're basically just destroying our soft, wet bodies. So we're not actually doing more physical work. Whereas these machines can channel much more energy into physical work. So that's another advantage. And then finally, in terms of production, uh, of the machines. It's much more scalable because you have these standardized components that can be kind of produced on assembly lines. And yeah, basically to produce hardware, like you can do that. Like yeah, you can do that definitely within months and like probably in days. Whereas like it takes 20 years for like a human basically to reproduce themselves. So
Right.
in terms of like how things would scale, like if
Yeah.
in the sense that a human economy relies not only on intellectual work or physical work, but in the end, it also requires more humans to be born over time. Otherwise, the economy fails.
Right.
And if you kind of compare that to what would be this kind of tech economy or this kind of automated tech economy, the part of like having more uh, entities kind of doing the work, that can be scaled up much faster. So there's just kind of a limit in terms of like what you can do with these humans. Like
Yeah.
even if we're maybe more like energy efficient, our brains are more efficient and we can kind of self-heal, like the cells in our bodies can heal themselves, whereas these machines need this kind of long supply chains. So there are certain advantages that we have, but that basically only works in an environment where there's the scarce kind of resources and you kind of can only kind of acquire them locally. Um, when you can have machines automate the extraction of energy to kind of run more machines, that kind of shifts. Like the energy cost goes in terms of dollars goes down. Like
Yeah.
it plummets towards zero as you kind of automate the extraction of energy, like all the coal, oil, nuclear, solar power that we have. You basically just run all that through much faster.
Right.
Um, then yeah, I mean that energy is not really you're not going to be able to use that to do human work, but you can channel it for the machines. And because the energy cost just plummets, you can just have machines basically um, do good enough work in ways that's just going to be more economically efficient in terms of like how companies are going to be able to profit from it. So like humans just kind of become unviable in terms of like employment. And like that becomes the risk there. That you just basically have like people can be thrown out of companies and things like that as kind of companies become more and more automated to the point that you basically have this kind of machine economy split off from the human economy or human society. So when I'm actually talking about AI, this is like the end point I'm talking about.
Right.
So I'm not just talking about something that seems to be able to kind of generally perform some kind of intellectual work across many domains,
Yeah.
but I'm actually talking about fully autonomous AI systems, so fully autonomous learning machinery, which you would basically end up with like a machine economy that kind of is able to perform those three types of work will be fully autonomous. So it can basically do everything it needs to be producing the components to maintain itself, and that means it's fully autonomous.
So, in a sense, for that kind of cognitive side of what AGI can do specifically, in terms of, what it can do on a mental level, you mentioned that, kind of self-recursive intelligence is a bit difficult because the real, human world is a bit more complex and a very like specific set where, consequences are determinate. Where do you kind of see that limit ha stopping? Like, if it's not self-recursive intelligence where the AI can just like exponentially get more impressively like intelligent and can kind of see everything like omnisciently, kind of where is the limit that you kind of see the AI systems having? Oh, sorry, I think you're muted. One second. Yeah.
Yes, that's a great question. Um, and yeah, there is sometimes an assumption, I feel like there's a implicit assumption in the AI safety community that like intelligence is built on intelligence, and it will just kind of
Yeah.
run. Like they'll show these graphs of like, okay, they'll use IQ as some kind of metric of intelligence, which there's some questions you raise about that, and they will just kind of extrapolate it towards like infinity, basically.
Yeah.
Um, and there are actually limits here that we need to take into account. Like for one, like yeah, maybe maybe AI systems are going to learn another law of physics, but basically, like as we've kind of seen in like work in physics, a lot of like the fundamental stuff we've already worked out. So like, are you really going to add much to like things like kind of electromagnetic, like in terms of forces, electromagnetic forces, weak, like all of this stuff, weak and strong nuclear, like gravitation. Is it going to be some new physical? Like, it's probably not going to be as significant.
Yeah.
So there's just ways that you just kind of run up against like, okay, there's you start by learning kind of some of the major kind of stuff about how the physical world works,
Yeah.
and then yeah, after that there's declining returns. But moreover, I think sometimes people refer to kind of what I'm talking about as like God-like AI,
Yeah.
and I see how it's kind of a neat shorthand for people, where they're like, okay, yes, it's because it's very intelligent and it's much more intelligent than people, and so it will look like a god to us. Um, it is a bit hypey, so that's one way I don't like it. I think it just kind of pushes it towards more of what I think would actually be dangerous.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that it has this kind of Christian kind of connotation of like, oh, this could be an omnipotent and omniscient God, like an all powerful and all knowing kind of God,
Mhm.
which also might be beneficial, like or kind of benevolent, like the Christian God. So there's a lot of kind of cultural baggage that can slip in here,
Yeah.
and the notion that this system would be kind of omniscient, that it would just be all knowing, actually doesn't make sense. And I think that might be the first thing that we could dig into here,
Yeah.
which is the notion of limits to control.
Right.
Um, and I'll kind of explain in terms of like what a control system basically is. It's a little bit different than how the alignment community or the AI safety community has been talking about control, but it's actually just based on a more kind of longer established field of control theory. Um, so an example of a control system will be the thermostat that you have at home. So basically, how do you kind of adjust the temperature in your home? And basically, you have a temperature setting, some kind of reference value that you're setting. So whatever it is, like I'm going to use Celsius because I don't know Fahrenheit, so 20 degrees Celsius. So that's one thing. You set that point. But it also is going to have some kind of temperature sensor, some thermoresistor,
Mm.
actually sensing the temperature in the room. So it's doing some kind of detection. And it's also going to have to like, it's going to make a comparison between like the temperature it's detecting and the value that you set. And then based on that, it needs to do some kind of correction through some other kind of actuator, some kind of heater in the room that's going to kind of heat up the room again if it is too cold. For a control system, you need at least those 3 or 4 steps, actuation into correction. That would be the other step. But there's actually something else going on here as well, because engineers actually designed this thermostat to work in your room. So what they actually had to do for that is they actually had to create a model in terms of like, hey, how does this actually work? Well, how does temperature regulation work in this room? And then like, how do you simulate based on like what kind of actuation or actions you do, what the outcome is going to be? For example, like in control theory, you have different ways of setting up a control system. Like your PID control, so you can have something that if it's slightly colder than your value, it can kind of suddenly boost up a lot of energy to kind of like heat up the room much faster, so it gets faster back to like that in line with that set point value. But of course, then it can overshoot. So like you basically need to kind of you can actually make your room too hot,
Yeah.
and so you need to actually kind of simulate for that in a way that to make that system work. Uh, um, and particularly once we start talking about like something like a fully autonomous kind of AI systems, these systems are actually going to be learning new code from the environment. They themselves are going to take inputs from the environment and process that into new code and use that code to process more information from the world into outputs and actions in the world. And they have to in order to be adaptive to the environment, because like the world around them is changing. So these systems actually have to adapt in order to stay relevant or be able to continue operating. Um, and and actually, moreover, there's this kind of explicit learning going on, but these systems are also changing in another way, which I already started pointing to. If you have these systems producing their own parts, there's a kind of reproduction that actually starts happening.
Mm.
And these parts are very like you've got the code, like this kind of code that's called learn at a high level. So there's kind of variants of code, and also like the different hardware parts that get produced will vary. There will become some stochastic variation in the production of these parts, and different configurations will get embedded in the hardware parts. So at that point, you're talking about something like evolutionary selection. So these systems will, all of these kind of components that make up this fully autonomous AI and the configurations will end up like whatever ones that happen to cause effects in the world that result in those configurations being maintained and increased in the world will get selected for.
Yeah.
So like anything that kind of increases its existence exists more, basically. That's what evolutionary selection comes down to. And that's a kind of implicit learning, actually, because it's basically the system without maybe intentionally kind of be directed towards something itself. It is these components are actually kind of how they're configured is kind of learning of whatever works in the world
Mm.
for maintaining and increasing their existence. So you've got this fully autonomous AI system that's actually changing over time. And so whatever control system that you kind of want to embed in this, that's actually going to make sure that like that it's not going to cause any bad outcomes in the world, will also actually have to be not just kind of detecting or observing stuff. It will need to create new models based on observations to causally model what would happen, and then simulate, based on what actions this control system that's connected with or within this AI system, like it needs to kind of simulate, or based on what actions it's going to take, like is this going to stay in alignment with this reference value?
Yeah.
So you asked me what I meant with alignment. This is actually what I'm saying that alignment requires.
Right.
Often people in the community say like talk about like, okay, what kind of values should it be aligned with, or they make this assumptions like, okay, once we've kind of figured out like how to specify the values, like maybe then because it's very intelligent, if we just find a way for it for whatever it's kind of coherently kind of pursuing the goals to kind of just pick this up as its goals or its values, then
Yeah.
it will be able to do it. And I'm actually saying that's incorrect, because the system is going to be kind of constantly changing, causing all kinds of effects in the world that could destabilize human society and our ecosystem. And you'll actually need to, in order to ensure that all these clusters of nested components are not in some way going to destabilize our world, like you actually need a kind of control. You need to kind of have some control system embedded there to ensure that it doesn't do that. Like it's not enough to just say like, okay, we've got some file with some values in this AI system, like gold.txt. Like there
Mm.
needs to be some kind of implementation process that actually kind of observes what's going on in the world and then ensures that there's some kind of correction in terms of like what kind of effects these machine systems are having to ensure that the outcomes are actually staying in line with these internal values.
Mm.
Um, so any alignment method requires a control feedback loop. That is what I'm saying.
Is it possible? So, I don't know if you're too familiar with AI 2027,
Uh-huh.
but is it possible for a kind of misaligned AI in a sense to be more intelligent than whatever alignment system you try to use? It can kind of evade that, like kind of in the sense of what we're seeing like with Claude and
Mm,
these like frontier models in the modern day,
mm.
but to a far greater extent, I guess.
Yeah, I'm trying to see how to think about this. So I think there's two problems here, and I think I'm going to simplify this a bit, so it might not entirely answer your question.
Yeah.
But like traditionally, I've talked about how the alignment community has tended to kind of think about things in terms of, okay, there's some agent pursuing goals.
Yeah.
And there's this problem that people often talk about is this instrumental goal or instrumental convergence,
Yeah.
where like once you start thinking about a system that's going to be kind of planning for lots of different kind of goals over time, potentially, like it's going to find this kind of intermediary outcomes to optimize or plan towards. That's going to be able to allow it to kind of pursue all kind of those goals.
Mm.
And and obviously, like certain things that can help here, like because you have an AI system, if it can just like produce more hardware, so it can do more information processing and to solve more problems, then like it's able, like generally able to kind of solve like or kind of optimize more for goals. Or if it protects its existence, including from those pesky humans, kind of eliminates their influence. That's like another instrumental goal.
Right.
And I think when people sometimes talk about alignment faking, they're kind of framing it in this way. It's a bit like, okay, I somewhat disagree with this notion that like, not just somewhat, I actually disagree with the notion that like something like Claude or ChatGPT actually has goals. Um, but but I would say that like the way that people are thinking about it is a bit like, okay, it wants to do Y, and then in order to get to Y, it will do X. So like maybe it wants to be able to continue pursuing whatever it wants, but the people are kind of trying to get it to be aligned, and then it will just fake being aligned so it can continue be doing what it wants.
Mm.
That's how kind of people talk about it. So this is like a kind of instrumental kind of goal framing of the problem.
Right.
Um, so that's one way of thinking about it, and that's actually already something that I think has not been addressed as a problem.
Yeah.
But the other problem that actually is not actually just about intelligence per se, is this notion that once we're not just talking about intelligence, but artificial intelligence, and you've got some kind of artificial intelligence system evolving to fulfill its own needs, like whatever it needs to be maintaining and increasing of itself,
Right.
there's going to be a question of like, wait, what would these artificial systems need in the world? And
Yeah.
it's basically not what we need as humans to survive. So yeah, even just the production of hardware components, like these things need to be heated up in kind of lava-like temperatures, like again in Celsius, 1400 degrees Celsius, like maybe 2100 Fahrenheit. Um, you need lots of toxic kind of chemicals. Like you mean you're from Korea originally, and there's a study in Korea this shows that like 7% of the chemicals they use are carcinogenic, and there's been these issues of like um, workers at these semiconductor factories actually getting cancer and protesting, and family members dying.
Right.
Um, and this is all actually very like I mean these are we can call these machine environments, but these are like really still very constrained towards like what people need to work in these spaces. Like
Mm.
sure, some people are dying of cancer, sure, but like overall, like sure, there's like hellfire kind of lava furnaces, but we find ways to kind of you know get those environments mostly constrained so that kind of humans can work in them or can live in them. Um, but like if you've got this kind of runaway kind of evolving uh, kind of system like that's kind of performing all of its work to be maintaining of itself, yeah, things become different. Like and in that sense, it's not just about this notion of intelligence, like, okay, this system might have goals that are different than ours, and it'd just be better at like optimizing, finding ways around whatever we try to do to constrain it. Sure, that is definitely an issue that we will be talking about here, for sure. But the other thing is that it would end up getting selected for uh, causing conditions in the environment it needs to survive in ways that it can't even like track or correct for. Like
Mm,
whatever control system that's embedded in it's like, it cannot do this thing of like fully observing everything that's going on and modeling causally what could happen and simulate depending on what actions it takes. Because I mean, all that's happening basically kind of at this higher level of kind of digital code, but um, and it's basically kind of a way of trying to kind of consistently kind of model and or kind of align like how the system is behaving with against this internal reference value. So this kind of drive towards kind of consistent modeling, consistent detection, consistent modeling, consistent simulations, consistent kind of alignment with reference value for consistent correction mechanisms. I mean, but that's on the other hand, that's not really how evolution works.
right,
Evolution is actually just has a completeness to it in the sense that like any interactions that all these configurations have kind of embedded across distributed AI system that they have with the surroundings that happen to like over time kind of cause effects that result in the maintenance increase of those configurations get selected for.
right,
So there's a sense in which like you can't actually have that work. You can't have a control system that has that level of coverage that evolutionary selection has. You might be able to kind of causally model things at a high level, kind of find certain regularities, but it's actually within the highly kind of contextualized interactions and kind of irregularities that this evolutionary selection is also happening from the bottom up.
yeah,
So there's a mismatch there. So beside the problem of like if you have something that kind of intelligently plan and kind of causally model things in ways that we cannot, and can find way kind of workarounds or loopholes that we have not accounted for, that is definitely an issue, or that will be an issue. But you also have this issue where like there's actually kind of inherently it will just end up having different needs and will kind of and these needs are implicit and the system will just end up converging on those needs in ways that even itself cannot actually model with much coverage or
right,
it can even if we try and like do all our best like as like really well-meaning AI engineers to kind of somehow program some kind of way to control the system, it still won't work.
mm,
Um, so that's what I would point to here. There's actually multiple problems here, and while people have talked about the question about or how do we kind of specify goals and how do we implement goals? Like, oh, this turns out to be a harder problem because not only is there an outer misalignment problem, as the way people frame it, maybe too
yeah,
simplistically, but there's also the sense of like, wait, there's also this inner misalignment thing where like if you kind of train a system to have certain goals, it might actually end up getting trained for other goals. If the context changed, it might end up behaving differently. Yeah, that these are all problems that we'll be dealing with there. But there's also this problem that there's stuff going on that has nothing to do with the system being kind of coherently directed towards outcomes. It's actually that in a very distributed way, all of these kind of artificial kind of hard components and the digital code that's kind of stored in and processed in them and dependent on those artificial hard components will just get selected for whatever they need to be maintaining and increasing of themselves and kind of change codes in ways that create new capabilities that allow them to maintain and increase themselves.
mm,
Um, yeah, does it make sense?
yeah. So kind of like a self-selecting process in a sense.
Yeah,
Yeah. Um, okay. I guess kind of bring this discussion more concretely into what we're currently seeing in today's world. In your view, and from the data, from what we've seen, what do you think kind of are the incentives of many of these frontier AI companies? And how is that leading? Is that even leading to this kind of race to the bottom that people talk about? How has that kind of accelerated the kind of emphasis on creating AGI and kind of not considering these safeguards and these safety issues as much?
yeah. And I have to say, like, I'm from the AI safety community, and I think my community has actually played a major role here for the worse.
Yeah.
Um, so currently there are at least three, maybe four kind of AGI labs that like people say like are leading on the development
Right.
of kind of more general kind of operating kind of AI systems. Um, and the rough order in which these labs kind of got started is first it was DeepMind,
Yeah.
then like some people, Elon Musk and Sam Altman said like, oh, we don't trust the DeepMind people, we'll create OpenAI. And
Yeah.
then there was some like people at OpenAI who basically were enabled the development of ChatGPT, who scaled up to the early versions of GPT, said like, oh no, like we don't trust Sam Altman anymore. Like this guy's manipulating us. We'll start Anthropic. And and it's like Elon Musk later coming like, okay, like OpenAI threw me out. I'm going to start XAI.
Yeah.
So the people that originally kind of started this actually shared a lot in terms of like the way they were looking at world and like the ideology. This transhumanist thing kind of keeps coming up. And the AI safety committee is basically kind of supported that at each step of the way. If I'm going to be fair, like so, Eliezer Kauska, one of the founders of the AI safety
Yeah.
committee, actually connected Shane Lag and Dennis Hassabis with Peter Thiel to basically Peter Thiel make the largest investment in DeepMind before it got acquired by Google. Um, and OpenAI got money from what's now called coefficient giving from Holden and the people who then kind of supported Anthropic to start. Um, so um, that's one thing I would point to is that maybe there's an issue here in terms of like the ideology here that we've had because a lot of these people now basically become very worried about what's happening, saying, like, oh wait, like now there's all of these kind of labs they're kind of developing and that they're not actually doing it safely oh shit, like this is really bad. like,
Yeah.
but there's like, wait, what have we enabled here? Like, there's a way like there's a way that I think one of the reasons why this has happened is that the AI safety community just kind of assumed that progress was inevitable in AI, and then just said like, okay, so we'll just need to be in a position of influence to kind of influence these people to kind of ensure that the safety of the systems. And um, yeah, and where safety is this kind of like abstract notion of like it will be aligned or safe or like somehow, people just want the things that we want, but where people aren't, in my opinion, not very clear what that actually entails. Um, and but there have been other communities and other people who actually really pushed back against this.
Mhm.
So besides the AI safety community, you've got a community that I'm going to call critical AI or AI ethics, and you had um, while you had, for example, like Dario Amodei just developing GPT at OpenAI to the point that it could become ChatGPT, while saying like, oh yeah, like we'll just kind of do this faster so that we can make it safer. Like we'll just get ahead, so like we'll find a way to make it safe. You actually had another kind of like engineer, Dr. Tim Cabru, at Google publishing stochastic parents, and they
Yeah.
kind of listed various ways that these large language models should already not be developed, like things that we now encounter today. And for example, like how people tend to relate with these chatbots like they're humans. The environmental, just like the environmental kind of pollution and degradation that we're already seeing with data centers and like at decreasing scales, which over a long enough period of time can actually be existential if current trends continue. Um, and yeah, things like that. And where she was coming from as someone with an engineering background was like, hey, in order to ensure that a system is safe, you have to clarify what the scope is. Like you can't just say like, okay, just created something. I could just use it anywhere. That doesn't really work because then you like, how do you know it's going to work well? You need to actually kind of test it and like
Right.
be able to model like that. It's actually going to not cause weird kind of destabilizing kind of impacts in that context.
Yeah.
So you need to kind of scope, like, where is this going to be used? Who is it going to be used for? Like, what are the uses of this system? Um, and that's just standard practice in more established kind of critical industries like medical devices. You have to actually go through some pre-approval process where you actually need to document, like, hey, exactly where I said, like, where is this going to be used? Who's the target like group? You need to do just like a lot of documentation, a lot of testing, submit it to the Food and Drug Administration, which is currently, I think, falling apart a bit. But and then they actually have to approve that. Same with like manufacturing new cars. Like there's a lot of testing and documentation that needs to happen, and these cars aren't designed to just run everywhere and do everything. Like even for a self-driving car, if you approach it thoughtfully, which I think, for example, Waymo is doing more. You actually just have a certain scope in mind. You have what they call an operating design domain, where you say like, okay, this self-driving car or this car can run over these kinds of roads and these kinds of cities. Here are kind of limitations in terms of where it works and where it doesn't, maybe in terms of weather or things like that. And that's what you design for. And then there's traction in terms of making this system safe because you know what you're dealing with. But on the other hand, what's happened with these supposing AGI kind of labs or companies is they're just saying like, well, we can just train all the data that we can scrape anywhere from the data from anyone's personal data, and we'll just kind of auto encode, quote unquote, these large language models on all that text and just kind of like have it encode inscrutable functionality, and we'll just find out what it does basically, and all kinds of ways like these systems can kind of end up kind of doing things that we might not even like be able to predict. So there's ways of like basically in this training progress, it's very easy for someone to kind of introduce backdoors or like ways of kind of influencing how these models work that are just undetectable later. You can't even look at like the weights or like the code of this model later on, and kind of it's computationally intractable to actually find out like what kind of hidden functionality is in there. And that's kind of the way these systems work. That you can have all kinds of hidden functionality that only shows up for like particular triggers or inputs or series of inputs.
Mm.
Um, um, and then they suddenly reveal this hidden functionality that could be pretty bad. And then they not only that, then they have this idea like, oh, and you can basically just we'll release it everywhere, and everyone can use it for whatever they like. We'll have some terms and conditions, and we'll just say that so that we're not held liable. But people basically they'll push for anyone using it everywhere they like.
Right.
And I would say that to then go and say like, okay, but we really care about like safety and we want to make sure that these systems are safe, doesn't work anymore
Yeah.
because you've actually set something up that's just intractable in terms of you don't know, you can't, you have no way of kind of covering for all the potential failure modes that you're kind of introducing
Yeah.
through the development and release of the system as the way you've done it.
Right.
So, frankly, this is something that many people wouldn't like, but I think that if you actually care about the safety and not just of users, but just in terms of like not destabilizing the world around us, not causing some cascade of problems, that's really starting to see in terms of like mass disinformation, sexual abuse, like generated sexual abuse materials, uh, just like all of the things that would get people performing suicide, like all the things that you're kind of seeing with these models, and the ways that people also just starting to get disconnect from people around them. At least some people are, by kind of connecting with, hooking up to these models instead. Like basically a worse problem than what we saw with social media, where at least our content was still routed through the machines to other people, but now we're
Yeah.
just talking to the machines.
Yeah.
I think that and just a lot of other kind of ways that in kind of this kind of local, kind of personal, contextual ways it can end up harming people. I think we just need to actually be deliberate about this. It's like, hey, if this continues, it's actually going to destabilize society in a way that will become increasingly irreversible.
Yeah.
And I'm not even talking about the fully autonomous AI thing yet. I'm just talking about that. And I think there are many engineers and researchers working at these AI companies who actually mean well, who
Yeah.
actually really want to create a better world. Maybe no longer, like maybe have lost faith in humans. Maybe say like, hey, like we're kind of effed up as people, and I don't know how to deal with other humans. I don't know how to talk with them, and like we've got all these problems like climate change. We just need to do something about it. And like maybe I can align the AI system and so that it eventually takes over and like is very nice to all of us. Um, and yeah, I think there's just a need for those engineers and researchers to become clear about what they're actually enabling here.
Yeah.
And I, in some way, I don't really blame them because there's just this dynamic that happens in the tech industry and in companies everywhere where like the well-meaning people work really, really hard are kind of at the bottom, and then the people who are kind of psychopathic, like have these dark triad
Yeah.
traits who find ways to manipulate people for their own ends and like do it in a way that they sound like they mean very well, like find ways to climb to the top. So you've got the Sam Altman types or the Elon Musk types, um, yeah, climbing the way to the top of these industries and kind of directing things in a way that's actually not healthy for all of us.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think we need to kind of we need to kind of start there, into, like at the personal level, before even kind of digging into this question, like, okay, we're dealing with a kind of race to the bottom. Like, why do we have this race to the bottom?
Yeah.
I think there's a sense in which people are kind of framing this like I'm this individual actor who like means well and wants to do these things, and these other people who might kind of rush ahead of me and kind of be more reckless. So like I need to get there first and do things well so that the other people don't. Uh, and like maybe with a kind of selfish motivation of like, well, and then I can kind of profit from this or gain a lot of reputation or fame, which often these people don't actually talk about when they say they want to do good in the world.
Yeah.
Um, and I think we need to actually kind of get clear on like, hey, what are shared values here? What are we actually caring for? Like, what do we all need to live and thrive in this world? And start from that basis. And then if we're doing things that deteriorate that kind of puts us in this multipolar trap or this race to the bottom, like we just need to somehow find ways to get out of that together. Because
Yeah.
otherwise, we're not basically like even the rich tech people, they might be able, they'll be able to extract more wealth and kind of live more safely for some time. But over the longer term, they and like the next generations, particularly, are gonna have very shitty lives, and there's gonna be a loss of many of the things that we care about in the world, like the rich cultures, the nature, things that you can't, like communities, like where people can care for each other, things that you can't just buy with money, or you can't just use engineering to kind of like build back up again. That's just not going to do it. So yeah, that's one way I'm thinking about it, that what is needed here. And there are problems here, of course, in what I mentioned in terms of like sometimes, for example, what happened in the safety community, they talk with some CEO and this person seemed to mean really well. And then, they come start collaborating. And then it turned out that this person is kind of manipulating them. There's also, besides these multipolar traps, there's the principal agent problem.
Mm.
Um, where one person might need to delegate work or kind of delegate something to another person, give them funding as the AI safety community did, or send like engineers their way as the AI safety community did towards these AI companies. And we need to get really discerning in terms of like, wait, how are these people actually acting? They say they mean well, they say all these good things, but what are they actually doing?
Yeah.
Um, and we need to find a way to deal with another problem here is that these tech CEOs and the people at the top, in order to stay in power, they will basically have kind of stop kind of creating their own kind of group of lackeys. Like they're always kind of acting like a kind of king, like Sam Altman. You can kind of see him as some kind of king-like figure in his limited kingdom. Um, and basically, these lackeys, these engineers, and these people that they need in order to stay in power, somehow or another, they'll need to lead these people. Um, yeah, and there's basically what is called rules for rulers. There's a nice video about that out there, but I think CCTP Grey. So rules for rulers, where basically in order to stay in power, even if you mean well, you'll need to basically kind of gain more and more resources to channel to these kind of key people that you need in order to stay in power.
Right,
So
right,
these
right.
top researchers, um, yeah, government officials, and all those people, the money or the resources will end up kind of accumulating there. Um, and then like there will be more and more power consolidation amongst these people, and like as the rest of society gets disempowered. Um, yeah, so these are like critical problems that if we really care about our world, like we need to, given like how things are going, like given more broadly, basically how these kind of resource intensive kind of energy extracting machines uh, are already basically destabilizing society and the natural world that we need to depend to live. Like, I mean, climate change is basically an earlier example of that going on. And um, this kind of machine kind of scale up of extraction to kind of power more machines to extract more is what I would call like the mother of all climate catastrophes or all kind of ecological disasters. Like that's where we're heading to at this point.
Yeah.
Um, we'll need to be very clear-eyed about this, and then also like act from a sense of care and community.
Right. There's so many issues with AI risk generally right now. I mean, there's issues of climate change, issues of privacy, deep fakes, psychosis, mental health, education, critical. I mean, like there are like, you know, there are infinite things that, and I mean, new problems are popping up every day. Kind of old problems are kind of showing themselves in different ways, and kind of even older problems are kind of being exacerbated in a sense, by AI. Things that kind of existed before, but are kind of emphasized by AI in a sense. If you had to kind of pick one problem that you think is the most severe out of all, that we kind of see concretely in the world today, what would that one be?
It's a good question. I agree with what you're saying in terms of like AI is basically at the intersection or is an amplifier of many of the problems that they've kind
Yeah,
of stuck out that we've been unable to solve with the institutions that we have. So there's a governance problem there actually that we need new forms of kind of community governance and kind of collective ways of making choices that don't
mhm,
rely on us delegating to institutions then basically start decoupling from what communities care about.
yeah,
So that is an issue. And I'm trying to see like what is the problem? Um, because I would actually I think I can't really point to that, but I think there's actually maybe two problems here.
oh,
And that we can already see in the world today.
yeah,
And one is the ways that machines are used to kind of disempower and displace humans because of some of those characteristics that I mentioned before. So like faster and more consistent information processing, like able and like being able to kind of communicate information at much higher bandwidths than you and I can do by just talking face to face and like physically moving our vocal cords and physically gesturing. Like these systems can actually just move around electrons, and they don't have to wiggle around all of those atoms everywhere in order to do that kind of transfer of information or information processing. And any other things that I mentioned in terms of like physical machines, like doing labor, displacing kind of physical people doing physical labor, the production and the factory work, everything that we've basically started seeing to get automated since the industrial revolution. So there's that way that like basically human workers get disempowered and like less and less of the resources go to them and more of them get channeled to kind of scaling up the machines in
right,
this economy. So that is one aspect. And then there's this other aspect where basically these machines aren't integrating into kind of the ecosystem that humans are actually part of. So like kind of all the kind of the things that we need in the environment, like food, shelter, kind of clean air, water. These are like basic needs that we have. They don't quite match up with what these machines need. They're
yeah,
not integrating into the carbon cycle in terms of like how carbon basically can kind of taken out of the air and kind of used in various ways and kind of, then gets emitted back. Things like that. They're actually disrupting the carbon cycle. Um, and yeah, there's a sense in which these machines are actually just toxic if used at scale and the way they are. There's a way that what is needed for their artificial existence is in conflict with and potentially lethally in conflict with like what humans and kind of other organic life needs to exist. Um, so yeah, and as much as we want to kind of solve with that with like kind of temporary band-aids or like carbon, like carbon taxes or whatever, like that doesn't really, that's another way of kind of abstracting the problem,
right,
like just kind of being very fundamentalist about just the carbon emissions.
yeah,
Whereas what I'm pointing to is something that's like, wait, across the life cycle, quote unquote, of this hardware, because all the supply chains and productions, like what is that resulting in environments, like in all the power generation and kind of extraction and mining, like what is that doing to the natural environments, like to what we basically need to live healthy lives.
right,
And I'm saying that yeah, the way to like prevent this from happening is to not do it as much anymore. It's
yeah,
basically like a base just to stop. Um, like sometimes you cannot actually solve these kind of wicked, kind of intractable problems of technology that I'm pointing to, the problems that remain that we can't that are unaddressable by just using more technology. There's
yeah,
this idea, I think, in certain kind of tech circles and also in the alignment community. It's like, okay, we've got a problem with technology. Now we're just going to add more technology on top of that and hope that solves it. And then suddenly you have even more technology that you need to work with to
yeah,
to address. So, but maybe we can fix that as well. And tech companies, of course, love to do this. They'll end up creating some kind of problem, like, I don't know, plagiarism at universities. And then they'll create another kind of AI model that kind of detects plagiarism. And then, like you can kind of keep cycling like that, as that doesn't work either. And I think we need to kind of, yeah, have a sense of, instead of trying to simplify what's going on and kind of create these simple fixes that actually just don't deal with things, except
Yeah.
maybe in a very kind of temporary and kind of like local way, but don't deal with like the global issues.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of like how this machinery is kind of integrated and kind of produced, and like the side effects that they create that across time. Yeah, we'll need to actually kind of like, wait, what does we need to kind of hold this in a more comprehensive way,
Yeah.
and notice that there's a way that we can't actually properly constrain this dynamic if we keep going down this path. And we'll actually need to become a lot wiser. And instead of just wanting to have more powerful technology and assuming like just by having more powerful technology, we'll be able to kind of hold our care that way. Like we'll be able to kind of care for the world by becoming more powerful.
Hmm.
We'll actually just need to get much better at caring for the world and kind of being strong as communities and dealing with everything that's coming at us,
Right.
to care for the world.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, like you basically just enter into a kind of nihilism. It just becomes powerful, more power,
Yeah.
and you just end up just destroying a lot of stuff in the world. Like it's this complex society, and even more complex ecosystem that we as kind of fragile human beings need to survive. It's just, yeah, this basically I'm pointing to like a kind of precautionary principle here as well. It's like maybe don't do stuff that where there's a potential, like where don't move fast, because you could very easily break things. Um, yeah.
Very like very like Silicon Valley, move fast and break things. Yeah. I guess kind of the last question that, most people want to know. I think that a lot of very fundamental stuff about AGI has been covered. A lot of these risks, the incompatibility of certain aspects of AI and, machines, I guess all this whole idea of automation in general with humans. The last question I kind of want to ask is for
Mhm.
the average person, watching at home, what can they do about this? A lot of people, they understand, maybe that this is a problem over time. They kind of see the perspective, whatnot. But like, what can they actually do about this issue?
Yeah, I think what I'm pointing at is let's get more clear at like how machines, I mean, of course, like these machines can be beneficial, like they have benefits. Like it can be fun, like you can gain benefits out of using like something like ChatGPT.
Yeah,
Um, but next to that, there's a sense in which, okay, like for me as an individual, I can see as like, okay, that's kind of neat. And at the same time, like if we're caring for our communities or like our family, our communities, for maybe the surrounding nature, or for a nation, if there's a sense of like, hey, we're connecting with something that like, we're part of this greater whole that we're caring for here. Um, there's a question of like, what does this machine scale up do there? And I would say that's actually disconnecting us from what we care about, and yeah, degrading yeah, our family, our like relationships, community relationships, this kind of this these societal kind of ways of interacting and in democracy, um, and yeah, there's these complex kind of ecological kind of processes, like yeah, of course, forests and and then ocean life and all these other things that we've been talking about that we turn out to be dependent on for like food and for clean air and clean water and climate control. Um, and yeah, so this it's like I would be the first to say like, of course, yeah. Right now, these large language models seem quite beneficial and useful, but try and kind of expand, like kind of actually relate with it from the perspective, like what are you caring for here? Like what do you actually want to foster? What do you want to support in your life uh, over the longer term? And will this do that for you?
yeah,
Um, and and have conversations about that with other people. Um, like as I'm already pointed to here, like I don't think we can rely on these tech CEOs to do well for us. And frankly, I think these engineers, like I'm trying to have conversations with them. Um, but yeah, I'm making limited traction there as well. Like there's just ways that people can get quite tied up into like certain ideologies and ways of identifying with like how they're supposedly contributing to the world.
Yeah.
Um, and it's going to require a lot more kind of deliberative conversations, and then from there, consensus building, kind of actual kind of action, actually delegation of like work that needs to happen to address this issue with AI. And in that way, I want to say like yeah, all of us can actually start making choices here. All of us can start becoming more discerning what's happening with these AI companies. And
100%.
I'll invite you to get involved in that.
Well, thank you so much for the discussion. It was amazing. I hope everyone learned a lot from that. I think this was very fundamental in a sense, but something that, myself included, most people kind of need to kind of contextualize the space and this whole movement and, everything that's going on surrounding AI in general. So that was amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and if there are things you want to read more about, there's some things I can point to. So
Hmm.
I wrote a short book called Artificial Bodies, which is basically kind of a very short kind of story-like overview of like what I mentioned
Yeah.
would tend to happen with AI unless we actually act to prevent it as communities. There's also like this more technical work. So if you can go to the Limits to Control workshop website, we had a workshop about limits to control last year. So just go to limitstocontrol.org, where you can see some of the early papers and kind of public essays that we published for
Yeah.
that workshop. And we're also actually, I'm interested in talking with mathematicians because there's one or two proofs coming out, formal setups for proving loss of control. And that will be major. To be frank, it's a bit like Gödel kind of showing like the limits of mathematics. Like here we're kind of showing the limits to control.
Yeah.
And um, yeah, and finally there's this other work that I've got a Substack, so you can subscribe to that.
Yeah.
But I'm working on actually compiling kind of a longer book that kind of covers many of these aspects and like kind of draws on many essays and research that by people if you really want to dig into this stuff.
Yeah. Highly suggest all of those. I thought artificial bodies was really cool personally. So I highly suggest everyone to look at those. But once again, thank you so much for the discussion. Very enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Yeah, appreciate the conversation. Appreciate your questions.